I've always been spiritual and intuitive, with some periods of my life being more in tune with it than others. When my mother died, I became very upset and turned away from God, unable to comprehend how God could allow such a terrible thing to happen to such an unbelievably great and good person. I had effectively shut my intuitive side and was generally depressed. Just before she died, I relocated to Alabama in order to find a better job and relocate my family to a place where we could maybe leave some very horrible memories linked with what happened to my mother. During my stay in Alabama, I not only rediscovered my trust in God, but I also discovered my relationship with angels. It's not unexpected given that it's known as the Bible Belt. It was a sequence of incidents, some very tiny and others very large, that helped me stop being so negative. My intuitive side grew stronger, and I no longer feared it. My father died in Alabama after 4 years there. I had a feeling he was okay where he was. I kept working on my spiritual side and listening to the teachings I received. I recall coming back from Florida in early November 2020, having a peculiar feeling that I would develop COVID-19 and that it would be quite awful, but that I would be fine. I felt and received the same message several times over the next few weeks. I tried not to be afraid or focused on it each time I sent it away. I had a wonderful Thanksgiving with my family. It was one of the greatest we'd had in a long time because it was the first time in 8 years that all of my children were together. It was truly a blessing. My husband developed flu-like symptoms a few days later. My daughter-in-law and I began suffering similar symptoms a few days later. On December 3, 2020, my daughter-in-law and I went to the local urgent care center with flu-like symptoms and were tested for COVID-19. They advised us to monitor my oxygen levels, supplement with vitamin C and vitamin D3, and take cold medicine as needed. My husband had tested positive for COVID-19 at the time. As my symptoms worsened, I returned to the same urgent care facility on December 5, 2020, and was seen by a nurse before being seen by a doctor. My husband had called ahead to let them know we were on our way and that my oxygen levels were fluctuating in the 80s and that I was having difficulties walking and breathing. The doctor informed me I needed to go to the emergency department after just one glance at me. He looked at my husband, handed him some documents, and told him to take her right away. I didn't think I was that awful and didn't want to go, but my spouse pushed. We reluctantly followed the doctor's orders, and I let my husband drive me to the hospital. My husband was not permitted to enter the hospital. They forced him to drop me off at the COVID-19 patient's entrance. They brought me into the waiting room, loaded me into a wheelchair, and took my paperwork. I could hardly walk in the time it took to travel from urgent care to the point when they called my name in the emergency room to get my vitals. I realized I was in severe trouble because I was alone, powerless, and terrified. When the nurse noticed I was having difficulty walking to her, she came over and wheeled me to a back room. She took my vitals and blood from both of my arms there. I wanted to cry because I'd never felt so vulnerable and weak before. She then took me to the emergency room doctor. He stared at me with seriousness, then asked me a few questions and stated they were admitting me right away. They then transported me to a hospital room after taking me for an X-ray of my lungs. They hooked me up to several devices, began the COVID treatment, administered oxygen, and started an IV. I didn't realize I was in ICU until 5 days later. The nurses were really nice and checked on me frequently to see if I needed anything or how I was doing. One nurse said that both of my lungs were infected with COVID and that if I could rest on my stomach, it would help my lungs heal. I mentioned that I'd been unable to lie on my stomach since I was a young girl due to a back problem, but that I typically slept on my side. She said that was fine as long as I didn't lie on my back at all. I glanced over at the screen that displayed the X-ray of my lungs during the dialogue and noticed what seemed to be white cotton balls all throughout both of my lungs. I told her I'd try. My oxygen level continued to fall throughout the day and into the following. They kept increasing the machine's oxygen input until it reached its limit. The next step would be to intubate me, something I was desperately wanting to avoid. My pulse rate began to slow as well. My condition deteriorated from severe to very bad during the first 48 hours of my arrival. I got quite weak, unable to eat anything, and my coughing worsened. Again, the nurse came in and sat with me, explaining that lying on my stomach would make a significant impact. I eventually worked out how to put my feet over the edge of the bed, lean forward over my food tray table, and stretch forward with my arms out in front of me for 5 minutes at a period to relieve posterior strain on my lungs. I virtually lost track of time the first few days, and I'm not sure if I was in the ICU on the second or third night, when I was at my lowest. The alarms continued to sound because my pulse rate dropped into the 40s, preventing me from sleeping well. I recall sitting partially up, slightly turned to my left side. I felt something and noticed a bright light to my right that was both warm and relaxing. No, I'm too sleepy, I remember thinking or saying to myself, not wanting to recognize or accept it was genuine. The brightness drew my attention once more. My eyes were closed, but the light to my right was so strong that I turned slightly toward it. I could see a bright white figure next to me with long flowing golden orangish hair and no face. I recognized it was an angel and felt it. I felt protected, peaceful, and completely focused on where we were headed. Without moving or saying anything, but knowing I was comfortable and happy to accompany her. The next thing I saw, with my angel by my side, was a dark room with what appeared to be a gigantic swimming pool on the left side. It was a dimly lit indoor pool with a cement walkway to the right and a wall that seemed to curve around it. It was dark, but the wall to the right reflected the deep blue reflection of the pool water, as if the lighted pool lights were reflecting on it with the rippling white lines that were softly waving through it. I was so concentrated on the right wall that I didn't notice anything above us or even whether there were pool boundaries to the left. I saw my mother's face, initially from her shoulders up, when I looked on the right wall with the water reflecting on it. My father was on her right, followed by Dennis, a family friend, Jan, a friend and co-worker, and a man next to her, but somewhat behind her. I had never met the man, but I knew he was Jan's spouse. They were all 10 to 20 years younger, smiling, serene, and well-dressed. My mother passed away in 2010, and my father in 2014. Dennis died in early 2020, while Jan died in the summer of 2020. Each had died as a result of major health complications unrelated to COVID-19. When I looked at them on the wall, behind the water mirror, they were all entire and smiling. Despite the fact that none of them talked, I could sense their contentment, joy, and overall well-being. They each had a message from me that I heard without anyone speaking as I focused on each one. With the angel by my side, I strolled gently past each one after they talked to me without saying anything. My mother's voice and message were the first I heard, telling me she was fine and joyful and that everything was fine. My father expressed his happiness and contentment to me. Dennis urged me to tell everyone that he was fine and happy and that they would not condemn his wife, Lila. He stated that it was not her fault. She had done everything she could and was supposed to do. He also stated that he desired for her to have everything and that it was his time. He departed because he was exhausted from fighting cancer. Jan told me she was joyful, that she was no longer in agony, and that she had no anxieties. She expressed her relief that her husband had died. He had done everything he could, she explained. He tried to stay as long as he could, but he couldn't. He was great there, she said, thrilled with her. She could tell I was worried about him. She reassured me that he was okay and that his presence was not a problem. I knew and felt everything was fine. They all seemed to be telling me not to worry or be anxious, that everything was fine. They all seemed to be telling me not to worry or be anxious, that everything was fine. My angel and I began to feel as if we were moving forward to a new region full with brightness. It seemed as if we'd stepped upon a cloud with a puffy white space full of white light, yellowish white light, and golden white light all around, save for a small light blue piece in the far upper left area, similar to the sky with a light white fluffy mist all around. My gaze was directed to my right, where I noticed a very tall light entity with more light emanating from behind it. My first idea was that it was a tall angel, and as I approached it, it turned and faced me. It wore a hooded robe or a light clothing. I felt safe, serene, and even pleased as it leaned in to greet me. It began to show its face. As I stared into its face, I wondered who it was. She gradually pulled aside the hood or shawl-like covering over her head to uncover her face. I recognized her as Mother Mary as she lifted her hood and revealed her face. I was taken aback and wondered aloud, "Mother Mary? Really, Mother Mary?" "Yes," she said, with a nod and a smile. I even giggled and grinned because I had no idea I would be greeted by the Virgin Mary on the other side. I felt overjoyed and pleased to be in her company. She grinned and indicated to a very bright, extremely bright beaming light to her right. When I turned to face it, I was overcome with absolute adoration. It was all-encompassing and overwhelming. I transformed into a child, standing in front of this pure radiating light that became brighter and larger as I focused on it. I was aware that I was in the presence of divine love, God or source energy. I felt at ease and understood everything. We are all one, always connected to one another, and never separate from the source. Everything was coming to me at once. There's no fear, only pure love. I never felt compelled to cross over, but rather that it was all part of my progress. I went through everything exactly as I was supposed to. Everything had gone as planned. I was reminded that I'm a light worker and was shown my actual picture, which is a gigantic angel with huge gold wings dressed entirely in white. I felt so light and joyous, and I was informed that I would recover from my condition, COVID-19. At the same time, I understood that whether I passed or returned, my family would be well, but I was returning. I was reminded of the lesson to urge others not to fear or criticize others, particularly when it came to disease. The next sensation I had was like I was returning from the light. Many of my pets who had died before this were now with me, safe in the knowledge that I would see them again when I returned. I felt as if I were floating back through the fog on a cloud, still accompanied by my angel. I didn't see her, but I knew she was there. I opened my eyes and found myself back in my hospital bed. I was weak and fatigued, but I was overjoyed. I was overjoyed and confident that I would recover shortly. My health quickly improved over the next few days, and my energy began to return. I was able to breathe more easily, requiring less and less oxygen as time went on. I was able to move around, eat, and drink on my own. For the first time since my arrival, I was even able to take a shower on my own. They released me from the hospital after 3 days. Several of the nurses expressed their delight at how rapidly I recovered. One stated they referred to me as their star patient because of how well I performed. The physicians were likewise pleased and gave me only 2 minor medicines. I didn't realize it at the time, but the COVID had negatively impacted my lungs, heart, and kidneys. They were thinking about giving me platelet transfusion therapy. Furthermore, they debated intubating me the night I experienced the NDE, but opted against it the next morning when they noticed I was improving. It seemed strange leaving the hospital. Nothing seemed to have much depth. Everything appeared flat and the colors were bland. While driving home, I observed that the trees and everything were all muted in color. It just didn't feel right. What I had seen and felt in the light was more genuine than anything I'd ever seen or felt before or since. It's difficult to describe and put into words. Everything felt flat and drab when I got home, simply dreary. I recall glancing at the walls and thinking they seemed like they were from a movie set. False, but not the same as before. Each new thing I could do made me incredibly happy. Over the next 2 weeks, I got stronger. I was overjoyed to finally be able to sleep on my own bed, which felt like a large, soft, silky, fluffy pillow. Walking upstairs or into the next room required a lot of energy, but I was getting better every day. Everything was brand new to me. I remember sitting on the couch and feeling the blood going through my veins and my legs, and feeling my body from the inside out. It felt heavy at first, but it grew easier with each passing day. I could feel some discomfort at times, but not in the same way. It's difficult to express, as if I hadn't entirely recovered on this side. I felt disconnected from others, almost as if I lacked empathy. Knowing what I had witnessed, I no longer feared, worried, or was concerned about other people's dramas. I understood this and realized I had to demonstrate compassion and/or explain to them that it wasn't as horrible as they thought it was. To not worry or judge, and to simply know that everything is alright. We are all loved and come from the same source. We're just here to live out our lives in whichever form or character we've chosen. We are expected to take part in life. If we make a decision, we can change our minds if we do not like the road it leads us down. We must consider the ripples that our decisions will cause, but we must equally recognize that people who will be affected by those ripples have the option to choose how those ripples will affect them. We can always modify our path or choice, and we're only as constrained as we assume we are. We are limitless and have the ability to produce everything we desire or require because we are constantly connected to Source, never separate, always unconditionally adored. I recall sitting on the couch and admiring my hands, thinking how interesting and fascinating they are. I was overjoyed the first time I drove again, pleased and shocked that I was actually driving. It was almost as if I were a youngster again, taking my first solo drive. People's faces were partially obscured by masks throughout the store. I could see and sense their fury or terror in their eyes. But I was thinking to myself, they have nothing to fear. This isn't the actual thing, not the real I saw and felt in the light. That was the real realm, and it's as if we're an avatar in a game. And it's important to remember that this isn't real and it's only temporary. After about 5 or 6 weeks, I felt entirely back on this side. I admit I was sad, but I was grateful for the experience and appreciative for the opportunity to spend time with all of my loved ones here. I scribbled my notes within a few months of having the NDE, but it took me 9 months to go back and reread them and type them up. I'm still adjusting and figuring things out, but with a higher vibration and a stronger sense of appreciation for being here, knowing that I've lost several friends to COVID, the COVID vaccine, and other illnesses since my NDE. I know those who have departed are all fine, but it's difficult for those who remain to go on without them. We are never truly separated, and I occasionally sense and hear from people who have departed. I'm also in touch with my angels and can sense or see angels surrounding others when I concentrate. Life is an adventure that must be experienced.